Hey everyone, we start tonight with a piece of iron, the least glamorous hero in all of history. Iron made the medieval world, from swords to cathedrals to plows to prison bars. And somehow, it still lasts longer than your lawnmower. Before you get too comfortable, please like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And please tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who is joining us from all over the world. Now, turn down the lights and maybe turn on a fan to make a soft noise in the background. And let's take it easy as we start our journey tonight. If you ever visit a medieval cathedral, pay close attention to the ironwork, such as the gates, bolts, hinges, and railings. They've been there since the Crusades and have survived rain, plague, candle wax, and every tourist who has touched them for good luck. They're dark, strong, and still in one piece. In the meantime, your patio chair is rotting away like a piece of fruit that has been left out. Because it rained on it twice, people in the Middle Ages were known for being ignorant, dirty, and having strange medical theories about leeches. But when it came to metal, those people stumbled upon immortality. There was no science for blacksmiths in the Middle Ages. They had fire, instinct, and strong arms. You could use it to grate cheese. Bloomeries were small clay ovens that burned charcoal in pure spite. It sounds like a design flaw that they couldn't get the temperatures high enough to completely melt iron. Mistake, but for some reason it wasn't. The result was a spongy lump called a bloom that was full of slag, carbon, and divine chaos. That would be low quality now. It was just metal that wouldn't rust in the rain back then. And here's the twist. The impurities that modern factories would spend millions of dollars removing are what kept medieval iron from rusting. The microscopic cracks were sealed by the slag. The carbon made the surface stronger, and the phosphorus, which every modern metallurgist hates, made a barrier that heals itself against rust. To put it simply, their metal was dirty, uneven, and completely unbreakable. Your new steel, it's clean, works well, and is made to rust evenly, just like a tragedy in a democracy. The difference is that a group of people didn't plan out medieval iron. A man named Adric beat it into existence. He hadn't slept in 3 days and was probably mad at his cow. The iron got older and developed a dark, shiny skin called patina that protected it from wetness. Every scratch made it stronger, similar to trauma, but for metal. And since nothing was made in bulk, each hinge, nail, and chain was made by hand, so they all had their own quirks. Every time the hammer hit, it left behind tiny differences, flaws, character, and strength. This is something to keep in mind when you see an iron gate that is 800 years old and still works better than your car's brake lines. It didn't last because it was perfect. It lived because it was stubborn, dirty, and made by someone who really didn't care about. Not efficiency, just permanence. We don't know why it works, but it does, would have been the slogan for medieval metallurgy. Blacksmiths in the Middle Ages were somewhere between engineers and sorcerers. No books, no safety rules, and no idea of how to make sure things are good. But somehow, they made iron that could last longer than empires and maybe even your warranty. The bloomer was the most important part of their business. It was a big mud chimney filled with charcoal, ore, and hope. Air was inside, bellows that squealed like pigs dying pumped in air, making enough heat to soften iron but not melt it. It came out as a lump, a messy, spongy ball called a bloom that was halfway between metal and regret. After that, the blacksmith would heat it up again and hammer it hard, getting rid of bits of slag, folding layers, and sometimes cursing so loudly that it sounded like a prayer. It took a long time, and it was very painful. If your local ironmonger said he would deliver in 3 days, he meant 3 moons and a few existential crises. Problems. But the fact that this method wasn't perfect was what made it so magical. The heat that wasn't even, the random amount of carbon, and the small amounts of silica and phosphorus all came together to make a kind of accidental supermetal. There was something different about each piece of iron, and it was strange how it protected itself. The blacksmith was making something like sourdough in metal. It was alive, not always the same, and almost impossible to break. Steel is made in clean factories these days, measured in tenths, polished to a mirror finish, and made to fit, to fail with grace. On the other hand, medieval iron looked like it had survived the end of the world before it even left the forge. It had bumps and pits, and sometimes it hissed when it rained, but it wouldn't die. That's funny. The forge in the Middle Ages was a dirty hole in the ground full of smoke, but it does something that our clean, computerized factories can't do. Long life. It's like comparing a monk's manuscript to an IKEA catalog when you compare their messy, hand-forged art to your mass-produced drill bit. Sheet of instructions. In today's world, we value purity in everything. Pure steel, pure ingredients, and pure intentions. Blacksmiths in the Middle Ages, on the other hand, worshipped survival. They didn't care about being clean. They were worried about whether their door hinge would last longer than the next plague. That's how they accidentally made one of the greatest engineering wonders in history, slag. When iron was smelted, slag was the unwanted byproduct. It was a gooey mix of silica, charcoal, lime, and anything else that fell into the furnace. That weak. Most metallurgists today would say it's contamination. In the Middle Ages, blacksmiths called it Tuesday. Every piece of iron they made had these tiny glassy bits all over it, like freckles on a person's skin. And that's what kept it safe. The slag didn't just sit there, it worked. The tiny specks sealed the surface and made a kind of patchwork armor that kept oxygen and moisture from getting in. In a way, every piece of medieval iron had built-in self-defense, like a chemical version of no trespassing. In comparison, modern steel is too clean. It's like a bodybuilder who looks great but gets sick twice a month. We refine, polish, and mix everything together until there's nothing left to protect it from the elements. It's not bad luck if your stainless steel sink starts to rust after a few years. It's the design, but iron from the Middle Ages was very dirty. The slag worked like nature's glue, filling in gaps and holding the metal together. Some pieces even got a glassy outer crust that made them almost immortal. Gates and swords that are hundreds of years old still have this. A dark, shiny skin that looks like black marble. That slag is still doing its job long after its maker died. The best part was that the blacksmiths had no idea why it worked. They believed that the ore from some areas was blessed or that the smoke from their forge had magical powers. They didn't know they were doing one of the most advanced corrosion resistance tests in history by accident. So, yes, iron from the Middle Ages lasted for hundreds of years because it was full of junk. Modern steel doesn't work because it isn't, which just goes to show that perfection isn't always necessary and that a little bit of junk can keep you alive for 800 years. Before the Industrial Revolution and its focus on efficiency, blacksmiths in the Middle Ages had a simpler relationship with technology. Hit it until it works. And if it still doesn't work, hit it again. But this time, with more anger, their furnaces didn't run on coal or oil. The original renewable energy source for them was charcoal. People who didn't realize they were helping the environment. To make charcoal, wood was burned slowly in a pit with little oxygen until it turned into light, carbon, and something that could hurt a blacksmith's lungs. It was hot enough to soften iron, but not melt it, which was a good thing. You see, melting iron would have gotten rid of the impurities that made it strong. The lower heat, on the other hand, kept all that great trash chemistry inside while the iron slowly cooked in the bloomer. It got its flavor from the charcoal, atoms of carbon. This process, which is now called carburization, turned the surface into iron carbide, a tough, dark layer that didn't rust. To a blacksmith, it just looked like they had done a good job. He didn't know that carbon was making iron stick together. He only knew that his blade didn't break when it rained. The best part was that charcoal didn't just make the metal stronger, it covered it in soot, which formed a natural black patina over it. That patina didn't come off in flakes like modern paint does. It looked like a protective tattoo as it got older. You could scratch it, dent it, or leave it outside for 100 years, and it would still look like it had stories to tell. Coke, a faster, hotter, and cleaner fuel, replaced charcoal in modern industry. It gave us shiny metal that looked great on factory floors, but not so great anywhere else. Coke got rid of phosphorus and other impurities by burning hotter, the same things that made iron last forever in the Middle Ages. Charcoal was what made medieval metal come to life. Coke made ours have a midlife crisis. The blacksmiths were covered in soot and sweat without even knowing it, learned how to do the first sustainable metallurgy. Slow, not perfect, and stubbornly natural. Every spark from their forges had carbon, history, and the faint smell of genius that happened by accident. Phosphorus, the element that made iron last for hundreds of years, would be the patron saint of medieval metallurgy. Ironically, modern engineers now treat it like a toxic coworker. These days, you won't hear factories bragging about having 3% more phosphorus. But in the Middle Ages, this impurity, was quietly fixing the world one hinge at a time. This is the short version. The ore they used wasn't pure. It came from iron deposits in swamps or rocky hills full of phosphorus that would normally make modern steel too brittle to be made in large quantities. But blacksmiths in the Middle Ages didn't care about making things in large quantities. They wanted to make one thing that would last until winter. When they melted down that ore with a lot of phosphorus in it in their bloomeries, something amazing happened. The phosphorus stuck to the iron's surface, forming a thin, invisible shield that slowed down corrosion like natural armor. These days, scientists call it a phosphate passivation layer. People in the Middle Ages called it luck and went back to hammering things. Phosphorus is magical because it makes the surface water repellent. The water slides off instead of soaking in. It's like medieval Teflon, but not as useful and more likely to give you tetanus if you don't handle it right. This tiny barrier meant that even when the walls were sweating, iron didn't rot away in damp cathedrals. On the other hand, modern steel is cleaned so much that it is almost dead. We get rid of all the phosphorus because it makes machining less even, which is good for making things, but bad for their long-term use. In the name of progress, we've basically put rust back into our metal. The Vikings and people from Northern Europe were especially lucky. Their local OEs were naturally high in phosphorus and low in sulfur, a perfect mix for iron that won't break. Archaeologists have found Viking nails that are still shiny after being buried for 1,000 years. Your garden spade, on the other hand, looks like it fought at Hastings and lost. So, yes, iron from the Middle Ages survived because it wasn't perfect. It was strengthened by accident. Phosphorus changed bad things into good things, a divine chemistry trick that no one understood but everyone benefited from. They didn't know about science. They were lucky, patient, and had a little bit of swamp magic, and for some reason, it worked better than ours. If medieval Europe's ironwork was impressive, India's ancient metallurgy basically rolled up its sleeves and said, "Hold my crucible." Long before Gothic cathedrals or Viking swords, Indian blacksmiths had already made something that still confuses modern engineers: iron that won't rust. For more than 1,600 years, the Delhi iron pillar is one of the most polite ways to say, "Screw you," to rust. This 7-meter tall monument was built sometime in the 4th or 5th century CE and has withstood monsoons, humidity, pollution, and people's curiosity. And it still shines. People wait in line to touch it for good luck, not knowing that they're petting one of the most advanced pieces of technology made before the Industrial Revolution. You guessed it, phosphorus, charcoal, and slow, careful work are the keys. Small furnaces melted the iron for the pillar, which was then carefully welded together layer by layer. The hammer strike forced out the slag and sealed the joints, making the structure so dense that even air molecules have a hard time getting in. A compound called misawite formed on the surface over time. It is made up of iron, oxygen, and phosphorus, and acts like armor that heals itself. In other words, it doesn't rust, because it keeps fixing itself like a metal and smug superhero. Our modern skyscrapers, on the other hand, are made of alloys that are so pure that they almost break apart when they touch. Moisture. There isn't even paint on the deli pillar. It doesn't need it. It just sits there, watching the years go by, while car bumpers nearby dissolve in 10 years. What makes it really poetic is that no one in ancient India knew so how it worked. There was no formula or scientific theory. It was just years of trying things out and guessing. These smiths weren't trying to make things perfect. They were looking for something that would last. And they got it. The post isn't just made of metal. Its philosophy was hammered into shape. Proof that being patient and not perfect can last longer than anything we call progress. In today's world, we have machines that can use lasers to cut metal. Men with hammers lived in the Middle Ages, and somehow the results were better. In the Middle Ages, people shaped every piece of iron by hand, beat it until it begged for mercy, and then beat it some more. It was a relationship based only on fire, noise, and safety concerns at work. Forging was both engineering and exorcism. The blacksmith would take a bloom, which it was a lumpy, slag-filled piece of half-cooked metal that they heated up until it glowed orange and then started hammering it into submission. Each strike got rid of impurities, made the grain smaller, and spread the carbon unevenly. That sounds sloppy to a metallurgist. It was therapy for the iron. The constant hammering made medieval iron have a complicated internal structure with layers of slightly different materials. Those differences turned into tiny shields that slowed down corrosion and cracks. The outcome was not consistent, but it lasted a long time. It lived on because it was so stubborn, like a peasant in the Middle Ages. Modern steel, on the other hand, is too uniform. Machines press and roll it into smooth, even sheets that are always the same. The metallurgical equivalent of a corporate worker who looks good on paper but can't handle stress. Iron from the Middle Ages had personality. It was thick in some places, soft in others, and full of secrets. If it bent, it did so in a graceful way. It rusted with grace. The forge of the blacksmith was more of a church than a workshop. Sparks flew like prayers do. The anvil sang with every hit, and the iron literally breathed, getting bigger and smaller and coming to life. Every time the hammer hit something, it was like a heartbeat. The blacksmith was doing more than just shaping metal. He was making it happen. And maybe that's why their iron lasted so long. There was a little bit of the maker's craziness in every sword, hinge, or chain. The kind that automated rollers or quality control spreadsheets can't copy. When you hold medieval iron, you're holding something that remembers being born in fire and violence and somehow came out calm. Your modern wrench, on the other hand, was made in a factory and raised by robots. It will die from being wet before the next tax season. Iron wasn't just a resource for the blacksmith in the Middle Ages. It was a living thing that needed to be persuaded. They thought that every bar had a personality, a will, and even a mood. Some iron wanted to be a sword. Some people only ever wanted to be a horseshoe. You didn't just make it, you also talked about it. Engineers today would call that a superstition. In the Middle Ages, blacksmiths called it Tuesday. They didn't use formulas, they used fire. They measured in a handful, a while, and when it feels right. They could tell the temperature by the color, the carbon content by the sound of a strike, and the quality by how the sparks danced in the dark. It wasn't exact, it was a gut feeling. It was a kind of spiritual metallurgy that left me with burns, calluses, and a cough that never went away. Still, this way of thinking worked better than most of the logic we use in business today. The blacksmith didn't care about being efficient. It was about staying power. He didn't care how quickly he could make 10 nails. He was worried that each one would last long enough to hold a door through 5 generations and maybe even an invasion. They thought iron had memory, which it kind of does when you look at it from a chemical point of view. The constant reheating and hammering made the grains remember their shape, which made them less likely to rust or break. Each piece was different, and it was a conversation between people and things. It's hard not to admire that they weren't just building, they were getting closer to each other. Every time the hammer hit something, it was like a conversation, part punishment, part prayer. It wasn't just forged metal when a sword or gate left the forge. It was a tempered feeling. We use algorithms and blueprints to build things these days. Perfectly measured, perfectly dead. It's okay if a product doesn't work. If iron from the Middle Ages failed, it was personal. A broken hinge was a sign of disrespect to your ancestors. The blacksmith. He didn't put away his tools when he got old. He became one with them. His hammer handle was smooth where his sweat had soaked in. His anvil had grooves in it from years of use. People said, "The forge has gone cold." Modern factories don't go cold. They just shut down for maintenance, which seems less poetic and a lot less permanent. Medieval blacksmiths may not have known chemistry, but they did know one universal law. If you leave iron alone for long enough, nature will eat it. So they didn't leave it alone. Alone. In fact, medieval maintenance routines bordered on obsessive. Every sword, hinge, and gate was constantly rubbed, oiled, and polished, like a beloved pet that could also kill you. Unlike us, they didn't wait until things started creaking. They cleaned their iron the way monks copied scripture daily, reverently, and with quiet fear of eternal damnation if they messed up. Knights kept their armor spotless, not because of fashion, but because rust was armor's version of leprosy. A single orange spot meant they used tallow, beeswax, linseed oil, and sometimes animal fat from last night's dinner to fight it off. Imagine a fully armored knight standing by the fire, rubbing pork grease into his breastplate while debating theology. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. The fat kept moisture out, the soot added protection, and the smell kept most peasants at a respectful distance. Blacksmiths used tar for bigger structures like gates, fences, and church hardware. And pitch, these sticky black coatings weren't just waterproof, they were nearly indestructible. Some cathedral hinges still bear traces of them today, like ancient fingerprints of paranoia. Modern people, meanwhile, treat rust as an aesthetic problem. It gives it character, they say, as their garden furniture crumbles into iron flakes. Medieval people didn't romanticize decay, they declared war on it. They also had a cultural advantage. They didn't own 200 disposable things made of cheap steel. They had one sword, one plow, one cauldron, and they took care of them like family heirlooms. In a time when everything you owned could be melted down and reused, maintenance was not only necessary, but also moral. A rusted sword was an insult to its maker, and a rusty gate was an insult to God's craftsmanship. They didn't just keep metal, they kept meaning. So the next time you see a medieval artifact in a museum, remember that it's not just there because it was well made. It's there because someone 800 years ago took time to rub sheep fat on it every week like their soul depended on it. And in a way, it probably did. If modern steel has one great flaw, it's that it was designed by people in a hurry. Everything about our metal screams, we have a deadline. Medieval iron, on the other hand, was the slowest thing ever made that wasn't a cathedral. It took days to smelt, hours to hammer, and entire seasons to finish a gate. Iron back then wasn't just a material, it was a time investment that could ruin your sleep, schedule, and save your soul. The bloomer, that ancient furnace of chaos, didn't rush. It burned slowly, unevenly, and inefficiently, just the way the metal liked it. Each batch had its own personality, depending on the ore, the charcoal, and how many bad decisions the apprentice made that day. If modern production is a sprint, medieval ironwork was a pilgrimage, and that's the thing. Time changed the iron. The longer it sat in the forge, the more the impurities mixed and the carbon seeped in. Each time the metal was reheated or hammered, it became more stable. It wasn't chemistry, it was patience disguised as physics. Today, steel is made in minutes. Factories melt, refine, and roll it in one continuous process. Perfect for mass production, terrible for endurance. It's like comparing a home-cooked stew to instant noodles. One nourishes you for a lifetime. The other dissolves before you're halfway done eating. Medieval blacksmiths also let their iron rest. Literally, after forging, the metal would cool in the air. A polite way of saying, we're tired and it's dark. But that cooling allowed the structure to settle naturally, forming grains and stress patterns that gave the metal flexibility. When a sword hit armor, it bent instead of shattering. When a gate weathered a storm, it flexed instead of cracking. They didn't have thermometers or metallurgical microscopes, but they understood rhythm, the tempo of iron. You worked with it, not against it. Our modern age loves shortcuts, faster production, thinner coatings, cheaper alloys, but every shortcut comes with a timer. The medieval blacksmith didn't build for speed, he built for eternity. So yes, your shovel rusts in 2 years because it was born in a world that no longer believes in time. Their iron survived centuries because it was forged in one that did. By the time the Industrial Revolution rolled in, humanity decided that handcraft was overrated. The age of soot, steam, and spreadsheets had arrived, and with it, the slow death of indestructible iron. What had once been a sacred act of forging became a factory process powered by profit margins, not hammers. The result? Faster, cheaper, shinier metal that rusts like wet bread. Factories replaced blacksmiths, and the blast furnace replaced the bloomer. It could burn hotter, melt faster, and refine iron to near purity, which sounds like a good thing until you realize that pure iron rusts faster than a moral politician. By purging out the phosphorus, slag, and carbon that medieval smiths had. We also got rid of the very chemistry that made their iron last for centuries. In the past, every bar of metal had its own character, with streaks, layers, and flaws that protected it. Now, industrial steel comes out the same way every time, which is sad because it's like processed cheese, smooth, cheap, and guaranteed to go bad faster than you think. The New World didn't have time to care. Steam engines, ships, and railways needed tons of metal, not longevity. You didn't fix something that broke, you replaced it. The blacksmith's art of patience was replaced by production schedules and quality control charts. The forges that used to glow red with craft now glowed white hot with deadlines. And the irony is that the refined iron that fueled the Industrial Revolution literally corroded the machines that made it. Railway bridges had to be repainted all the time. Ships rusted faster than they sailed. Factories built to last a century were falling apart before the ink dried on their blueprints. The age of progress had officially declared war on itself, and nature was winning. The blacksmiths of the past had made metal that grew old with dignity. The factories of the future made metal that died young and shiny. Efficiency became the enemy of endurance. So, while the Industrial Revolution gave us locomotives, skyscrapers, and a sense of superiority, it also gave us the reason every car needs a tetanus shot after 3 winters. The medieval world may have been dirty and slow, but at least there. Iron didn't need paint that didn't rust. It turns out that progress sometimes just means learning how to rot in style. Modern science hates inconsistency. If 2 things don't come out exactly the same, someone gets fired. But medieval iron thrived on inconsistency. It was born in chaos, forged by instinct, and made up of 1,000 tiny mistakes that somehow got along. Every bar of metal was unique, unpredictable, and beautifully unreliable, and that's exactly why it endured when a medieval blacksmith pulled a bloom. From the furnace, it wasn't perfect. It was a tangled mess of slag veins, carbon spots, and silica pockets, a geological smoothie. As he hammered it into shape, those imperfections didn't disappear. They rearranged. The metal became a mosaic of micro-ruptures, hard in one spot, soft in another, dense here, porous there. It shouldn't have worked, but nature likes weird. Modern steel, on the other hand, is the overachiever of the periodic table, pure, uniform, and emotionally fragile. It rusts evenly, cracks neatly, and fails exactly when predicted. It's great for engineering and terrible for immortality. Medieval iron didn't fail neatly. It limped along for centuries, defying logic, science, and your car's warranty. Those micro impurities, the slag, the carbon, the phosphorus, acted like a built-in defense system. If rust started creeping in, it would hit one of those barriers and stop. The corrosion slowed, then stalled. The iron didn't resist decay. It redirected it. It made peace with oxidation, like an old knight who learned to take a punch. Even the color of medieval iron told a story. It wasn't shiny or uniform. It had depth, dark streaks, subtle gloss, a quiet dignity. It looked alive. Modern metal, in contrast, gleams like a mirror right until it starts peeling, like sunburn. There's a reason we still find medieval gates, tools, and swords intact after 800 years, while stainless steel appliances are shedding flakes in your kitchen after 5. We traded patience for polish, endurance for efficiency, and individuality for conformity. The blacksmith's forge was never about perfection, it was about survival. His goal wasn't to make flawless metal, it was to make forgiving metal, something that could bend, scar, and keep going. The 20th century gave us many miracles: flight, electricity, and the ability to ruin good metal with marketing. Enter stainless steel, the material that promised immortality and delivered disappointment. We were told it would never rust, never stain, never fail. And like every two, it sounds too good to be true, but it came with fine print. Unless exposed to oxygen, water, or time, stainless sounds eternal, like something Zeus himself would use for cutlery. In reality, it's a fragile diva. Sure, it resists rust in a laboratory. In your backyard, where humidity and pollution play tag, it doesn't stand a chance. That fridge handle or garden trowel, give it 2 years and it'll look like it's auditioning for a historical reenactment. The secret of stainless steel lies in a thin, invisible layer of chromium oxide that forms on the surface, a passive film that stops rust. It's clever, yes, but also clingy. Scratch it, expose it to salt, or sneeze near it wrong, and that film breaks down. Once it's gone, the metal corrodes faster than your willpower at a buffet. Medieval iron, meanwhile, didn't bother with invisible layers. It built its protection into its very structure. Impurities, slag, and carbon that fought corrosion from within. No coating, no lies, just chemistry and stubbornness. In 1913, metallurgists invented stainless steel in their search for modern perfection. They wanted metal that looked clean and didn't need any upkeep, because nothing says progress like getting lazy about upkeep. It worked, sort of. Stainless steel is perfect for scalpels, sinks, and shiny kitchen aesthetics. But compared to medieval iron, it's a high-maintenance celebrity with a skin-air routine that costs millions. Here's the irony. The term stainless doesn't even mean won't stain. It means stains less. It's like saying that ventilation in a medieval dungeon is optional. Medieval blacksmiths never said their work was rust-proof. They knew it would change, darken, and age. That was the point. Their iron didn't fight nature, it worked with it. Stainless steel tries to outsmart nature and loses every rainy season. If you ever want to feel small, compare the life work of a medieval blacksmith to your IKEA bookshelf. His creation still exists, but yours wobbles. The 13th century and the age of same-day shipping, people forgot the difference between building something and making something. The medieval forge wasn't a workshop, it was a way of thinking. Every spark and every strike of the hammer had a purpose. The smith wasn't just shaping metal, he was testing his patience, strength, and sometimes his sanity. His work was slow, messy, and terrifyingly loud. It was the metallic heartbeat of civilization itself. He worked with flaws because he lived in an imperfect world. He didn't see flaws as failures, but as part of the character of the material, something to be guided, not erased. When the metal resisted, he adjusted his rhythm. When it cracked, he folded it again. In a way, the forge was a mirror. If the smith lost focus or temper, the iron punished him. Modern metallurgy has forgotten this dance. We treat iron like a resource, not a relationship. Machines handle it now, efficiently, emotionlessly, rolling it, stamping it, packaging it. The result is products that shine but never last. They're perfect until they're not, and then they're replaced. The medieval smith would have been horrified, not at the technology, but at the attitude. To him, crafting metal was an act of humility. You didn't conquer nature, you collaborated with it. The iron came from the earth, the fire from the forest, the air from your own breath. It was all part of a cycle, one that modern progress has proudly paved over. Even the blacksmith's tools reflected patience. His hammer wore down over decades. His anvil became smoother with age. He didn't throw them away. He adapted to their new form, the way his apprentices adapted to his temper. Nothing in his world was disposable. Today, we build things that outlive our attention span, but not our lifetime. The smith built things that outlived dynasties. So maybe the lesson isn't about metallurgy at all. It's about mindset. The blacksmith didn't strive for new, he strived for forever. And, ironically, that's what he got. If the Middle Ages gave us one lasting miracle, it wasn't castles or cathedrals. It was iron that simply refused to die. Centuries later, it still hangs from church doors, anchors bridges, and guards tombs, quietly mocking every rusted car and crumbling skyscraper humanity has built since. Empires rose and fell, languages vanished, but that medieval iron's still there, still doing its job, probably rolling its molecular eyes at us. That durability wasn't luck, it was attitude. Medieval blacksmiths didn't build for the next quarter, they built for eternity. Every hinge and sword was a message to time itself. You can try, but you'll lose. They didn't outsource craftsmanship to machines or shave minutes up off their process. Their forges ran on patience, sweat, and a mild disregard for efficiency. Meanwhile, we've mastered the art of disposable everything. Our tools rust before the warranty expires. Our skyscrapers need constant repainting, and our innovation mostly means making things thinner and weaker so we can buy them again next year. Progress apparently now comes in cycles of corrosion. What's left of medieval iron tells a different story. It was forged imperfectly, maintained obsessively, and respected religiously. It didn't just resist time, it collaborated with it. Every year, a thin film of oxide built upon itself, sealing the metal tighter, making it tougher. Medieval iron didn't fight decay, it aged into strength. It's poetic that the cathedrals that hold it together have been struck by lightning, shelled by wars, and rebuilt by faith. Yet their iron still clings to the stone, blackened and calm, as if quietly saying, "I told you so." It has seen kings crowned, nations fall, and entire industrial revolutions come and go, all while your car battery dies if you look at it wrong. The lesson isn't about metallurgy anymore. It's about how we treat the things we make. The blacksmith built for permanence, because permanence meant pride. We build for convenience, because convenience means profit. Their iron endures because it wasn't made to be replaced. Before dawn broke over the crooked roofs of medieval Europe, a faint rustle could already be heard in the gutters. The sound of 1,000 tiny claws. The rats were awake. They owned the night, swarming through the refuse of cities that stank of rot, smoke, and desperation. And somewhere in that darkness, another creature stirred, the rat catcher, a man. He wasn't a hero, but he was necessary. In an age when the plague moved unseen, riding on the backs of vermin, a rat catcher was the only one standing between survival and pestilence. He didn't wear armor, only layers of torn wool, stiff with filth and the stains of his trade. His boots, if he had them, were caked in the mud and awful of the streets. The smell of his work clung to him like a curse, a mix of death, smoke, and the sour scent of rat fat. When he passed, people would cross themselves or pull their cloaks tighter, not out of hatred, but superstition. Rats didn't fear much, but they feared him. He knew their habits, when they nested, where they ran, and what they craved. He could hear them even when others couldn't. That faint scratching beneath floorboards that foretold disease. He followed the sound like a bloodhound, crouching in silence before striking with unnerving precision. One crack of his stick, one twitching body, and a dozen others scattered into the dark. Yet the rat catcher's life was a gamble. One nick from a flea-ridden carcass could mean death within a week. His profession carried no honor, no protection, and no reward worth dying for. But hunger made a man inventive. The towns needed him, even if they pretended not to. Each morning, when merchants opened their shutters and saw, they thanked God for fewer rats, but never the man who was responsible. By noon, he would be gone again, moving on to the next part of the city, following the scratching chorus beneath the filth, and hunting the creatures that thrived where people didn't clean. In a world rotting from within, he was both savior and scavenger. The medieval rat catcher's tools looked less like instruments of work and more like the relics of a madman. His kit was a patchwork of necessity and desperation, a sack of traps, a jar of foul-smelling bait, and a stick polished smooth by years of killing. Some carried smoke pots made of clay filled with burning herbs, or sulfur to choke rats from their hiding places. The smoke was thick and vile, and so was the job. A good rat catcher learned to breathe through his teeth, not his nose. In the countryside, rat catchers favored dogs, wiry, half-starved terriers with scars across their muzzles and an appetite for squealing prey. Others used ferrets, small and vicious, sent slinking through barns, and bait, and a stick that had been smoothed out by years of killing. Some carried clay pots filled with burning herbs or sulfur to choke rats out of their hiding places. The smoke was thick and disgusting, and so was the job. A good rat catcher learned to breathe through his teeth instead of his nose. In the country, rat catchers liked dogs, wiry, half-starved terriers with scars on their muzzles and a taste for squealing prey. Others used ferrets, small and vicious, to sneak through barns and grain stores to flush out the vermin. But in the narrow alleys of London or Paris, it was mostly man against swarm. Grain stores to flush out the vermin. But in the narrow alleys of London or Paris, it was mostly man against swarm. Wooden traps with iron jaws snapped shut in the darkness, and the sound, a sharp click followed by frantic squealing, was as familiar to the catcher as a priest's bell at Mass. Bait was the secret, a mix of dried fish, cheese rind, and anything pungent enough to carry a scent through filth. Some men swore by blood, others by sweet wine or rancid oil. The smell could turn a stomach, but to the rat it was. The catcher would scatter crumbs and sit still, waiting in the dark with his stick held like a knight's lance. But every tool had a curse. The stick might break, the smoke might backfire and choke the user. The traps might catch more fingers than rats. And the fleas, always the fleas, invisible assassins jumping from the twitching bodies, carrying the seeds of the Black Death. The rat catcher's hands were covered in bites, his skin raw and scarred. Many of them had a cough that wouldn't go away, a rattle in their throats, the lungs that never went away. Still, he worked because without his trade, towns would starve and disease would spread unchecked. He wasn't chasing rats for glory. He was chasing rent money, bread, and survival. And as the church bells rang in the distance, he tightened the rope on his sack and moved to the next street, ready to face another swarm of teeth and fleas before sunset. For all his skill and risk, the medieval rat catcher's reward was pitiful. He was part of what might be called the filth economy. Those forgotten tradesmen who kept cities alive while wading knee-deep in humanity's waste. Nightmen emptied cesspits, leech collectors trolled the swamps, and the rat catcher stalked through the alleys where no one else dared to tread. Without them, disease would have swallowed entire towns. Yet they were treated as unclean, tolerated, not respected. Payment was rarely in coins alone. A merchant might toss him a loaf of stale bread or a mug of watered ale for a day's work. Sometimes a housewife would. Pay him in scraps or old clothes, anything to keep the scratching in her walls from getting louder. On good weeks, he might make enough money to buy a seat at the tavern table, where he would sit alone while others sat just far enough away so that they didn't smell the smoke, death, and rat carcass on his hands. Still, there was opportunity and pestilence. In plague years, the demand for his services spiked. Fear made people generous. For a time, they'd pay that almost anything to have their homes cleaned, though the people who caught rats thrived on fear. The more the city panicked, the more their business boomed, but greed always followed. The same people who begged for help at the height of infection would haggle the price down once the smell of death began to fade. If the rat catcher complained, they'd accuse him of spreading disease himself, a walking curse, bringing vermin with him wherever he went. More, more than one unlucky catcher was beaten or chased out of town when the rats came back. But the job never went away. Cities needed him, even if they didn't want to admit it. The rats were always there, eating through grain stores, digging into monasteries, and even making nests under the floorboards of rich people. So the rat catcher came back night after night, working for pennies and crumbs in a market that smelled of filth, fear, and human hypocrisy, where the poor man who saved lives couldn't. Every medieval rat catcher knew one thing: he was never really in charge. The rats were too smart, learned quickly, avoided traps, and bred faster than any man could kill. A single female could have dozens of babies in a month, and within weeks, a new swarm would take the place of the old one. It was a losing war fought with sticks and smoke, and the enemy always came back hungrier. To outsmart them, rat catchers studied their prey like scholars of vermin. They knew that rats preferred warmth, grain, and filth, and they followed the smell of food through cracks and drains. A good catcher could follow a colony's trail just by smell in the dead of night, the faint smell of grease, waste, and fear. Some even said they could tell the difference between black rats and brown rats in the dark. The black ones were smaller, faster, and much more dangerous because they carried the fleas that spread the plague. Cities became battlegrounds, not of swords, but of survival. In grain stores, taverns, bakeries, and in monasteries, the rats were in charge. The catcher moved like a shadow, holding a torch and letting smoke curl behind him. His presence was as much ritual as work, a mix of superstition, science, and sheer grit. Some people said that certain rat catchers could talk to the creatures and lure them out with chants or whistles. Others thought that their smell, which was half human and half rot, drove the vermin crazy. But the rats always fought back. They bit, clawed, and swarmed when they were cornered. Many catchers had scars on. His arms and ankles were covered in thin crescent marks where desperate teeth had broken skin. Some of them caught fevers days later and never got up again. But there was no stopping. Leaving rats unchecked meant famine, disease, and ruin. So the battle went on, unseen and endless. It raged on beneath the cobblestones, inside monastery cellars, under market stalls, and through the rafters of manors. The hunter became part of the city's immune system, unwanted but necessary. Every rat killed was a small victory. Every night survived a miracle, and though no one thanked him, the rat catcher knew his grim purpose. He fought not for gold, but for a fragile, plague-ridden peace. When the Black Death swept through Europe, the rat catcher's grim trade became something close to prophecy. Towns that once mocked his smell now begged for his presence. Bells tolled for the dead, carts rolled through streets filled with corpses, and behind it all, rats. Countless rats feasting and breeding. The catcher's work was no longer it was about keeping people alive, not just keeping food safe. But even he couldn't stop the invisible killer that clung to the fleas. The symptoms came on quickly: fever, swelling, blackened skin, and soon even the bravest catchers began to disappear. Some towns made the trade illegal, saying that the rat catchers brought the plague instead of stopping it. Others treated them as holy men who could drive death away with their smoke and sticks. It was a time when fear and superstition mixed together. During the plague years, catchers walked the streets like ghosts, wrapped in rags and soaked in vinegar. They stuffed herbs into their noses and prayed to Saint Sebastian, the saint who protects people who are sick with the plague. They burned nests by the dozen, using sulfur and pitch until the air was thick with poison. Rats ran in all directions, down drains, across rooftops, and even over corpses, and the catcher followed them without stopping. For some, the job became a kind of madness. They started to think that the rats could talk because they were surrounded by death and isolation. The vermin carried not only disease, but also messages from hell. Chroniclers of the time wrote about catchers who dreamed of black rivers of rats and gnawing teeth whispering in the dark. Whether it was delirium or guilt, it haunted the men who survived. But without them, whole towns would have fallen faster. When the plague retreated, leaving streets empty and silent, the rat catcher remained, weary, half mad, and poorer than ever. He had faced death every day, and still he had nothing to show for it but scars and the faint smell of smoke and ash. The smell of smoke and ash lingered. In the end, the plague years showed what few wanted to admit. Civilization was always one rat away from collapse, and the man most hated, the filthy catcher in the alley, was probably the only one who really understood that. Every experienced rat catcher had his secrets. The job wasn't just about strength and luck, it was also about cunning, timing, and understanding fear. After all, rats were smarter than most people thought. They remembered smells and patterns, and could sense danger. To trap them, the catcher had to think like one. He learned to move quietly, to read the signs, droppings near a flour sack, teeth marks on wood, the faint shuffle behind a wall. He'd sprinkle flour across a floor to see tiny footprints by morning, revealing where the creatures passed in the night. He'd bait traps, not with abundance, but scarcity. A single piece of meat left untouched for days until the rats grew bold enough to trust it. Patience was as vital as any. Weapon, many catchers made their own bait. One swore by a mix of blood and beer, and another but by burnt bread soaked in oil. There were also secret recipes for poisons that used crushed herbs, deadly roots, and powders that worked slowly so the rats wouldn't connect the food with death. The church didn't like this kind of work and called it witches' work, but no priest ever came to help when the rats took over a granary. In some towns, the smartest catchers used music. They'd whistle or hum as they worked, thinking that the vibrations scared the rats away. Others carried charms or wore talismans made from rat bones, sure that they would keep them safe from disease. Whether it was superstition or coincidence, every catcher had his own ritual before a hunt. He might spit 3 times before lighting his smoke pot or cross himself twice when he went into a cellar. When your life depended on luck, the line between faith and habit was easy to cross. Still, some men took pride in the craft, showing off their kills at the town square, where rows of limp tails were nailed to a post like trophies. The crowd would grimace, but they would still gather to count them, secretly grateful. It was proof that someone was fighting the hidden war beneath their feet. The rat catcher knew he'd never be honored in song or story, but when he emptied his traps and watched the vermin burn, he found satisfaction in silence. His victory wasn't applause. It was the brief, rare sound of a quiet street. No matter how vital his work, the medieval, the rat catcher killed rats in the town square and hung their limp tails on a post like trophies. The crowd would grimace, but still gather to count them, secretly grateful. It was proof that someone was fighting the hidden war beneath their feet. The rat catcher knew he'd never be honored in song or story, but when he emptied his traps and watched the vermin burn, he found satisfaction in silence. His victory wasn't applause. It was the brief, rare sound of a quiet street. No matter how important his work was, the medieval, the rat catcher lived on the edge of society. People needed him, but they never wanted him close. He walked a fine line between survival and stigma, only being let in when the city gates were open. Once the rats were gone, so was his welcome. Kids threw rocks at him and called him Rat Devil. Tavern owners made him drink alone, if they let him in at all. Priests frowned when he entered church, as if sin clung to his coat. Even beggars stayed away, not out of pride, but out of fear. The rat catcher was full of smoke, sweat, and blood, and rot. He was a reminder of everything the townsfolk pretended didn't exist. Still, he knew things others didn't. He knew the secret paths beneath the city, where water and waste met. He knew whose cellars were clean, whose grain was rotting, whose homes echoed with scratching in the walls. Knowledge like that carried power, the kind that made mayors whisper and merchants pay under the table. Some catchers used that leverage wisely. Others became extortionists, releasing a few captured. People said that rat catchers worked with witches, that they made potions from rat bones, or that they called swarms of rats to curse their enemies. Some people even wore black cloaks or carried carved staffs to scare those who made fun of them. Fear was as good as money. Even though they were insulted, some townspeople grew strangely fond of their local catcher. He was the only one who would go into sewers that no one else would, risking plague for the sake of catching rats. Pennies, who turned filth into safety. When plague returned or famine struck, they sought him out again, the same man they'd spat at a week before. But fame in his world was a curse. The moment peace returned, he was forgotten once more, a necessary evil stored away until the next crisis. And so he roamed from town to town, nameless, friendless, yet indispensable. The rat catcher had no parish, no home, and no legacy. He was the city's shadow, tolerated only as long as the scratching in the dark didn't stop. For a people, the rat catcher lived on the edge of faith and fear. His job was half craft and half curse, a strange dance with the creatures everyone hated. In the medieval mind, rats weren't just pests, they were symbols of sin, gluttony, and the devil's work. To catch them was to fight evil itself, but to live among them was a different story. Villagers whispered that rat catchers consorted with demons. How else could one man control such a plague of creatures? Some people said they made deals, trading their souls for control over rats. Others thought they carried charms made from rat tails or bones soaked in blood and blessed under the new moon. Some even wore necklaces strung with the teeth of their prey, saying it kept the sickness away. It didn't work very often. Church records from England and Germany mention rat catchers accused of witchcraft. Their smoke pots filled with sulfur and herbs looked a lot like cauldrons, and their muttered curses sounded like spells. When the plague came back after a cleansing, the villagers turned on them and yelled that the catchers had called the rats back to punish the ungrateful. Some people were kicked out of town, some people disappeared into the woods and were never seen again. But superstition was a double-edged sword. Fear earned respect, or at least made people think twice. A good rat catcher could use that fear as a weapon. He would come in a dark cloak with half of his face covered and talk in a low voice. He would make the people of the town wonder if he was a man or something else, completely. They would pay him faster and ask him fewer questions if they were afraid of him. The rat catcher's strange aura became part of the urban legend in the cities, where there were as many rats as there were people. Moms told their kids that if they didn't pray or wash, the rat man would come at night and take them away in his sack. He was both the boogeyman and the savior, cleaning up the world and reminding it how dirty it really was. He wasn't sure which role was real by candlelight. Not anymore. He sometimes wondered who was really hunting whom when he saw the rat's bright eyes in the dark. The world of the rat catcher started to change in the late Middle Ages. The towns got bigger, the streets got busier, and the walls got taller. But the rats stayed. They changed faster than any human reform. As sanitation got better and city laws made it illegal to dump trash in the streets, the catcher had fewer places to work and fewer people who wanted to pay him. The trade that had once kept him alive was now disappearing into memory. He still walked around. He carried sacks on his back and a joint in his hand as he followed rumors of infestations from one crumbling village to the next. Kids didn't throw stones anymore. They were interested in the relic from a different time and stared at it. He was like a ghost from a time before soap, sewers, and hygiene. In some towns, people were more interested in his arrival than scared. He talks about the years of the plague, when rats were as big as cats, and scratching could be heard through every wall at night. Not many people believed him, but they still paid attention. Some people who caught rats took on apprentices and taught them what they knew: how to follow a scent, how to kill without getting close, how to tell if a rat was smart enough to avoid a trap. But most of them died without leaving a mark, their names forgotten, and their bones buried outside the city walls. There were no tombstones to mark their graves, only the fact that there was no scratching under the floorboards. The rat catcher had become a legend by the time the Renaissance began. In German towns, people talked about the Rattenfänger, the Pied. Piper was a mysterious person who played music to lead rats and kids away. Historians would later say that the story was based on a real person, maybe a rat catcher, who disappeared after a job went wrong. Myth had taken over history. The truth is that the rat catcher's spirit never left. He lived on in every pest control worker who went into an attic and every worker who had to deal with dirt to keep others safe. The tools were different. The smoke turned into chemicals. Steel became stick. But the goal stayed the same. 2. Fight the bad things that happen when people don't pay attention. And in the stillness of an old European cellar, the scratching still starts at night. A faint reminder that the rat catcher's job is never really done. There were fire watchers on towers before the fire department, alarms, hydrants, or buckets neatly lined up in rows. They looked over the wooden skeletons of medieval cities from dawn until the early hours of the morning, looking for the first hint of smoke. Every thatched roof, every chimney and flickering torch below them could have been a disaster waiting to happen. These men were the guardians of survival in a time when a single spark could wipe out a whole quarter. They climbed narrow spiral staircases that wound their way through stone bell towers and church spires, only to be hit by freezing wind when they got to the top. From there, they could see the whole world. Rooftops that looked like they were about to catch fire. Markets full of smoke from 1,000 fires. Their post was lonely, but it was holy. They were the eyes of the city, keeping an eye on things while everyone else slept. The flames weren't the only thing that was dangerous. It was being too comfortable. There were a lot of people living in medieval towns, and the houses were so close together that they looked like they were drunk. The alleys were so narrow that only one person could fit through. The roofs were made of straw, the beams were made of oak, and the walls were dry. One candle that fell over, one kitchen fire, and the fire would jump across the street before the church bells rang. The fire watcher's whole job depended on seconds to see smoke before it turned into a fire. A beast. They learned to read smoke like it was a book. A hearth was a white smoke. Dark smoke was a sign of trouble. They could tell if it came from wet wood, oil, or pitch. When there was a storm and lightning struck too close, they were ready, holding onto ropes that hung from the bell above them. One pull, and the city would wake up to a mess. Most of them only got a few coins and a cot near the base of the tower for their work. But their work affected the lives of thousands of people. When the sun came up, when the sun broke and painted the rooftops gold, they stayed at their post, squinting through the haze and chimney dust, hoping the day would end as quietly as it began. If they missed even one wisp of smoke, by nightfall there would be nothing left to see, just ashes and the sound of the bell ringing too late. The height of the medieval fire watchers was very important to them. His tower was a prison and a fortress at the same time. It was a lonely stone perch that rose above the maze of rooftops. Some towers were built to protect people, others for pride or bells. But they all had a second, more humble purpose, to keep an eye on things. Men were stationed on top of the tallest buildings in cities like Paris, Cologne, and Florence, so they could see for miles in every direction. From that point of view, a fire was no longer just a small accident at home. It was a storm cloud full of smoke and destruction. The towers themselves were very different. In some towns, the fire watcher climbed the church steeple, squeezing up slippery, wet stone staircases that twisted. In some, he stood on city walls or on quickly built rough wooden scaffolding for the job. The higher the tower, the safer the city, but the man was more alone. He might spend 12 hours or more in silence, with only the wind and the ringing of bells below to keep him company. There wasn't much gear. He might have gotten a spyglass, a horn or bell rope, a lantern, and a wool cloak to keep warm. Many cities didn't allow fire at the watchpost. They knew it was ironic, so Abrayer was a rare treat. He ate bread that had gotten hard from the wind and drank from a bottle and watched. Always being watched, his whole life depended on his eyes staying healthy. Every tower had its own schedule. The watcher had to signal that everything was fine every hour. In some places, a bell would ring once at midnight, softly reminding people that the city was still there. If he didn't ring it, people on the streets below could panic, and when the smoke did rise, there was no time to waste. The bells rang in a frantic rhythm, and the alarm rang out through the stone and wood. In just a few minutes, the whole city would know. The fire had come. Another man climbed the tower to take his place when morning came. Their talk didn't last long. A few words about the weather, the wind, and any strange fires. Then one came down, stiff and half frozen, while the other took his place in the clouds, taking on both the view and the responsibility of keeping the whole city from burning. Living in a medieval city meant living with fire and being afraid of it. Every house had a fireplace, every shop had a forge, and the streets glowed softly at night, from candles that were lit behind closed windows. People needed fire to stay alive, but fire didn't care about rules. It moved from roof to roof faster than a man could run, eating beams, cloth, and flesh. The fire watcher knew this better than anyone else. He couldn't sleep because the enemy never did. The threat was everywhere. Bakers started working before dawn, and their ovens were hot. Blacksmiths worked all night, hammering iron. Taverns lit torches that blew out in the wind. Not even the churches were safe. Safe. Their tall wooden spires were great for starting fires. Over the years, cities like London, Lubeck, and Bruges burned down and rebuilt. Every time it was rebuilt with the same flammable hope, and every time the fire watchers stood by, helpless, as the wind carried the fire faster than the bells could ring. They got a sixth sense for trouble, like a wisp of smoke that wouldn't go away. The sharp smell of pitch floated on the wind, and the faint orange glow against the night sky didn't belong to any. Hearth. One shout from a tower and one frantic bell would send the city into a frenzy. People running with buckets, monks chanting prayers, and guards yelling for order that never came. For the guards, failing was not an option. He might not make it through the morning if he saw the smoke too late. People in towns who were angry and sad often blamed the fire watcher for their losses. They would ask, "Where were your eyes?" As the ashes cooled, some were hit, some were even put to death for being careless. Watching wasn't just a job, it was to stay alive. Every night, they climbed higher and higher, their hearts racing as they whispered small prayers to saints who had probably grown tired of hearing them. The worst storms were the ones with lightning. One strike on a thatched roof could undo months of hard work. They got ready for screams when the thunder rolled from their lonely towers. They didn't see how beautiful the medieval city was. They saw how fragile it was. A world that is only one spark away from disaster. And when the pale light of dawn came back, it was. Victory is just seeing rooftops still standing. When the fire finally came, it never said a word. It roared. As soon as a fire watcher saw smoke, the still night became a living embodiment of panic. His first move was automatic. Pull on the bell rope with all your might. The sound broke the silence, booming over rooftops, echoing down narrow alleys, and waking up half the city. One bell meant trouble, and two bells meant disaster. Everyone knew the city was on fire when the bells rang nonstop. The reaction below caused instant chaos. People in homes started to move, men grabbing buckets, women carrying kids, and apprentices running to wells or rivers. People made human chains and passed water from one person to the next. Most of it spilled before it got to the fire. Guards tried to keep things in order by yelling over the crackle and roar, but fear was faster than reason for the fire watcher. The bell was just the start. He had to stay on the tower even when the wind changed and smoke rose to choke him. From above, he became the city's desperate guide, ringing in time to keep the bucket lines in line. Faster for the north, slower for the south. People listened in the dark, trusting his eyes that they couldn't see. He could see where the fire jumped from roof to roof, and where the wind blew sparks toward the cathedral or the market square. His heart beat in time with the bells, steady and angry. The streets below glowed red, buckets splashed, beams fell, and people yelled names into the smoke. Horses got loose, dogs barked, and sparks flew. It rained from the sky like falling stars. The fire spread so quickly that whole neighborhoods disappeared before dawn. The watchtower itself could turn into a pea, trapping its keeper inside. Many fire watchers died that way because they wouldn't leave their post until the flames reached their feet. When the sun came up and the smoke cleared, all that was left was silence and ash. Streets that used to be full of merchants and laughter were now just blackened bones of wood and stone. The air smelled like pitch and sadness. The fire, if he lived, the watcher would stand over the ruins of his city. He still had the bell rope in his hand and was thinking about whether he could have rung it sooner, shouted louder, or seen faster. Every sunrise was a win and a loss for him. The fire watchers really got to work when the city was asleep. When the candles burned low, drunks stumbled home with torches, and every window that was shut could have been a spark. Night was the most dangerous time. The fire watcher, who was high above it all, could see the glow of every hearth like stars scattered across the ground. From From his perch, he listened to the faint hum of the river, the distant sound of carts, and the crackle of something burning where it shouldn't. The change started at sunset. 2 or 3 men might have to do the job, taking turns during the long hours. They put on heavy cloaks to protect themselves from the wind and frost, and they covered their lanterns so they wouldn't be blinded. On clear nights, the horizon went on forever, but fog and smoke often made everything look like a gray sea. The flame. The watcher had to trust their gut, a different shade of shadow, and a flicker where there shouldn't be one. Some towers were ready with signal fires, little fires they could start to let other watchtowers in the city know. In places like Lübeck and Nuremberg, whole networks of towers used this method to send messages, which got the alarm out faster than any runner could. One bell would ring, and then another would ring, and then the whole skyline would shake with fear. But when the alarms went off, the watch was eerily quiet. The city below was quiet. The only sounds were the occasional barking dog or a drunkard's song echoing through the streets. People who watched fires got used to being alone. Some people sang quietly to stay awake. Some people carved tally marks into the wooden beams to keep track of their shifts. A lot of people became superstitious and whispered to saints or said charms to put out the devil's fire. They saw things that other people didn't. Meteors streaking across the night sky, thieves climbing roofs, lovers sneaking through courtyards, and sometimes strange lights moving beyond. The walls of the city. But nothing scared them more than the quiet after a storm. It meant that lightning had struck somewhere that wasn't visible. They would lean over the edge and look at every roof and chimney. Holding my breath, I waited for the tiniest wisp of smoke. Night was both an enemy and a friend to the fire watcher. It was a veil that hid danger, but also made him feel alive. He was the thin line between peace and disaster up there, with the wind howling through the stones of the tower. Hope wasn't enough for medieval cities by themselves to stop fires. They depended on fear. The law was strict, the punishments were harsh, and the fire watchers were at the heart of this uneasy system. City councils made rules all the time. No fires after curfew, no forges without someone watching, no baking after dark. Don't put candles near hay or straw. These laws should have made sense. In real life, they made everyone nervous, especially since one mistake could lead to public humiliation or worse. The fire watcher's first job was to find out where it started. If the flames were ever under control, officials would question the people who lived in that home. Bakers, chandlers, and smiths were often the first people to be looked at. A lot of people got fines, and some went to jail. If the fire killed people, a few unlucky people were put to death. Even a child knocking over a candle could ruin a whole family. People who watched were held to impossible standards. If you didn't show up for a fire or rang the alarm too late, you could be fired, whipped, or worse. Some were accused of falling asleep on the job, the worst sin that could ever happen. In some towns, a careless watchman would have to stand next to the ruins in public with a bell around his neck while townspeople cursed and spat on him. It was justice through humiliation, a warning to the next man who thought he could get away with it. Cities also had fire wardens who patrolled the streets at night, checked chimneys, and made sure people followed curfews. The people on the ground worked with the fire watchers from above, yelling warnings or throwing small stones to get their attention when smoke rose where it shouldn't. They made an uneasy alliance between being watchful and being paranoid. The city's defense against its own carelessness. But there was a limit to fear. The laws were written by nobles who lived in stone houses, not wooden ones. The poor couldn't afford safer building materials or more than one hearth, so they had to deal with the flames every night. The fire watcher knew this better than anyone else. He saw the same slums burn over and over again, and the same families lose everything while officials blamed. Careless sin, the city fathers thought that fire was a moral failure. It was just the way things were for the fire watcher, the cost of warmth in a world made up of things that burned. When the bells rang and the sky turned red, there were no engines, hoses, or uniforms, just people. Firefighters in the Middle Ages weren't professionals. They were just people who could be woken up in time. The fire watcher's alarm was their battle cry. Bakers, blacksmiths, monks, and guards would stop what they were doing to fight. With nothing but leather in their hands, every city had a rough plan for putting out fires, which included buckets, wet blankets, and blind courage. There were wells and water barrels all over the streets, and men formed chains, passing buckets from one person to the next in a frantic rhythm. The water didn't often hit its target. Most of it spilled onto cobblestones or into open mouths where people were gasping for air. Some people used sand or vinegar, anything that could put out the fire. People used hooks and long poles to pull down roofs that were on fire, giving up houses to save the block. It was a mess, hidden as coordination. The fire watcher stayed above the fire, still ringing and yelling directions to those below. He was their eyes in the smoke, telling them which streets were burning the most or where the fire crossed the river. People worked on instinct alone, not to save the city, but to save themselves. Sometimes his voice got lost in the noise. There were no prizes for being brave, only scars. Men fell to the ground from smoke. Women passed out from being too tired, and whole families joined the effort to save their houses. Priests walked around them, holding up crosses to the fire and sprinkling holy water on the coals, which made a hissing sound that didn't help. It was a fight of both the body and the spirit, a fight between good and evil, sin and survival. The survivors sat in the wreckage when the fire finally went out. Their faces were black with soot, and their hands were blistered. The fire watcher came down from his tower with red eyes and sore lungs. He was too tired to talk. He would walk through the ruins in silence, thinking about how much it had cost him to see them from above. Streets, where kids had played that morning, now just gray dust. There were no medals waiting for them. There were no songs sung. By dawn, they would start over, using the same flammable wood and straw to build again, knowing that another fire would come someday. But when it did, the bells would ring again, and firefighters made of flesh and bone would rise from the ashes again. To be a fire watcher meant living half a life, always awake, always waiting, and never really at peace. The city below might have festivals, markets, and sang songs, but the watcher stood out high above it all. Wind and stone, smoke and silence made up his world. Even when there was no fire, he could still remember the heat that burned, the screams that echoed, and the smell that never really went away. The job required a lot of strength. In the winter, nights on the tower were freezing, and in the summer, they were hot. Rain soaked through cloaks, wind howled through cracks, and frost made ropes as hard as bone. They stole minutes of sleep, and their meals were often cold bread, eaten with fingers that were numb. Many people who watched got sick from the exposure. The smoke burned their lungs, the damp air twisted their joints, and the endless squinting into the horizon hurt their eyes. Not many of them lived to be old, but they did, partly out of duty and partly out of need. Most of them were poor men who were hired for little money because no one else wanted the job. But there was also pride in it, a grim sense of satisfaction in knowing that their watchfulness kept the city alive. The people below might never say thank you, but they depended on them completely. Every safe night was a quiet win. Still, the loneliness went away. People who watched fires were often thought to be strange. Because they were alone, some people prayed while others drank. A few people said they saw things that weren't there. Ghostly figures walking on rooftops, phantom fires, and the faces of people they couldn't save flashing in the smoke. It was a job that was haunted by its own purpose. They knew how ironic it was. They were protectors of life, but they acted like they were already dead. Their towers turned into tombs of watchfulness with no names written down. When one person died, another person took their place. There was no ceremony, no goodbye, just another man climbing the same steps, holding the same rope, and looking up at the same sky. And they kept watching, because if they stopped, the city would fall asleep. And it was risky to sleep in a wooden city, because the fire watcher knew what others wouldn't admit. Civilization was always just one careless flame away from going out of existence when the worst was over and the smoke. As the fire watcher thinned into morning mist, he would come down from his tower like a ghost coming back to life. The streets below, which used to be full of laughter and trade, were now graveyards of blackened wood and smoldering stone. There was a heavy silence in the air, that strange stillness that comes after something bad happens. He would walk through what was left, his boots crunching on ash and broken glass, even when birds didn't want to sing. Kids held on to their moms and stared at the ruins that used to be their home. Bakers cried over burnt ovens. Merchants went through coins that had been burned and no longer shone. The person watching the fire didn't say much. He had a sore throat from yelling, his eyes from the smoke. People would look at him with both admiration and anger. The man who saw it first, the one who rang the bell, but not soon enough. It was never too soon. In a lot of cities, the day after the fire started, people prayed, not to scare people, but to mourn. Church bells rang, as if they were sprinkling holy water on the ashes, Priests led processions through the ruins to remember them through baptism. Officials counted the dead and wrote new fire safety rules, promising again that this would never happen again. It always did. The fire watcher usually went back to his tower by sunset. Repairs started below, but he had to go back to work right away because the embers were still glowing under the beams and the wind still carried the bell of danger. He would climb again, step by step, until he reached the same spot where he had seen the city burn. From there, he could still see thin smoke rising, ghostly trails, and maybe for a second think it was all starting over. But the rooftops turned gold again when the sun went down. Kids played in the ruins. The city's heart began to beat again, and the fire watcher stood silently high above the city as the light faded. His bell was quiet, and his eyes were tired, but not blinking. He knew that peace was an illusion, a brief break granted by mercy, not power. The medieval city was like a candle in the dark, and he was its trembling flame, always flickering and watching, one breath away from being put out. Dodge City looked like any other frontier town during the day. There were dusty streets, clapboard saloons, horses tied to rails, and a courthouse that tried very hard to look nice. But when the sun went down over the Kansas plains, the city looked different. The smell of whiskey, sweat, and sin filled the air, and lanterns came to life. Piano keys rang through open windows. This was the other trick that the preachers warned about and the cowboys dreamed about. On the road, the red light district was on the south side of Front Street, where the L's lantern burned dimly. It was a place where pleasure and survival went hand in hand. There were brothels, bars, and gambling dens along the muddy road. The soft oil lamps hanging above each door made them glow red. Men inside laughed too loudly and drank too much, hoping to drown the ghosts that followed them west. People called the women of Dodge a lot of different things. Dirty doves, painted ladies, and red angels. People in society said the words like curses, but behind the sneers were people who depended on them. Dodger's economy would have fallen apart without them. When the cattle drive stopped, these women kept the money coming in. They bought food, paid their rent, and spent the money that cowboys made faster than the saloon owners could pour them another drink. Many of them were widows, runaways, or women who were just too poor to live any other way. They were just as much a part of Dodge's frontier life as the gunslingers and gamblers. Some people worked in small cribs, which were one-room shacks with lanterns, while others worked in bigger parlor houses, where lace curtains and piano music tried to hide the fact that they were working. Marshal Bat Masterson and Sheriff Wyatt Herp could keep the peace on the streets, but they both knew better than to go too far into the red light maze. The town's sins were too useful and too profitable. Everyone, from the bartender to the banker, gained from what happened behind those closed doors. When